And you're watching World Inside. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our show today in Pyongyang, where a South Korean artistic troupe is on a 4-day visit. The group includes K-pop singers and a taekwondo team. This is the first in more than a decade for South Korean artists to perform in the DPRK. Before our panelists weigh in on what exactly is going on, take a look at this first.
A resounding inter-Korean cultural exchange. DPRK leader Kim Jong-un have seen South Korean K-pop singers perform in the capital. Last Sunday's 2-hour concert came as the frosty relations between the North and South thaw. Besides Sunday's concert, the South Korean taekwondo team did a separate performance.
We've got to give our first performance in Pyongyang today, and I find it very meaningful. The South and North taekwondo cultures share the same origin, but their growth processes are different. I'm proud and happy that we got to display our taekwondo.
Also on Sunday, the annual U.S. ROK military drills kicked off after a month's delay over the Olympics. However, this year's joint exercises downscaled significantly. The U.S. has deployed about 11,000 troops, about half of the previous number, while 290,000 South Koreans are participating, and no aircraft carriers will be involved. China has also worked with both sides on the Korean peninsula to further ease tension. Chinese President Xi Jinping's special envoy, Yang Jiechi, has met with Moon Jae-in in Seoul last Friday. Yang briefed President Moon about Kim Jong-un's recent meeting with President Xi Jinping in Beijing and said China was hoping the DPRK and ROK could make an important breakthrough in their relations during the coming leaders' summit.
We will continue to promote and reinforce the present trend of easing tensions on the Korean peninsula through in-depth communication with South Korea.
It seems all sides are receptive to showing gestures of goodwill leading up to anticipated talks between Kim and Moon, and a meeting between Kim and U.S. President Donald Trump.
For more on the situation on the Korean Peninsula, let's turn to our panelists. With us in Beijing, in the studio, Rong Ying, who is the Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Sir, it's a pleasure to have you here in Beijing. Joining us in Washington, D.C. in the U.S., Jenny Tao, an Assistant Director of the U.S.-Korea Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Jenny, it's good to see you. And in Chicago, we invited Carl Friedhoff, a Fellow in Public Opinion and Asia Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome as well. I want to start with you, Jenny. What do you make of this quote, "Spring is coming"? Isn't it? That's the title of this K-pop performance in Pyongyang. Is spring really coming? I really wondered.
I think that's the question we all have. It's great to have this exchange, these cultural exchanges. How that will translate again into sustained goodwill over time is yet to be seen, and especially as the summits come up. But I think we are definitely more optimistic than we were before the Olympics. And I think a lot still contingent though on how these summit meetings go.
Well, I heard Mr. Friedhoff that during the performance by the K-pop singers, South Korean singer singing a North Korean pop song, which is called the Blue Willow Tree. Of course, this is the least blue time, I guess, for the Korean relations right now. But the question is, do the two sides really have further trust toward one another? What's the next step in this tangle?
So I think trust is very low. If we look in past administrations on the South Korean side as well, they've all recognized that. We saw now impeached Park Geun-hye come in, and she had been pushing for trust politique. Even for President Moon, as he's been in office, he's been pushing for these meetings, but he's not really giving anything away just yet. he's been very pragmatic. I think the next steps are going to be to get through these military exercises, and if North Korea can refrain from criticizing them for calling them acts of war, which so far so good, then the stage will be set for the Moon-Kim summit. What comes out of that is going to be very interesting, as that is going to then build up to the Trump and Kim summit.
The inter-Korean relations have been soaring since the onset of this year. Early in February, a high-level DPRK delegation led by Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, and the president of the Presidium of the Supreme People's Assembly attended the opening ceremony of the Winter Games. Kim Yo-jong also met with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. Bilateral relations improved dramatically even further at the end of February. Another group of high-ranking DPRK officials attended the closing ceremony of the Pyeongchang Olympic Games. The leader of the delegation met Moon afterwards as well. Under Kim Jong-un's invitation, Moon's top national security advisor visited Pyongyang earlier last month and met the DPRK leader. A lot of meetings between the two sides. Likely in April, there's another very high meeting between the two sides, the top of the top. But the question is, Mr. Rong, are we going to see anything besides the ambience is getting warmer? But what about the real issues? Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the real warming up of relations between the two Koreas?
Well, I think so far we can be cautious, optimistic about this round of interactions, particularly...
It's been a while, Mr. Rong, I have to say, before you said the phrase cautiously optimistic when it comes to Korea issues. So when it comes to that, we should say congratulations to everybody so far, at least, right, Mr. Rong?
Exactly.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the reason is that, as we have seen the past few months, the very quick succession of the meetings. And remember that happened after quite a long period of tension and even crisis. So I think we have all the reasons. And more importantly, I think if you look at the inter-Korea relationship interactions, it has been even more, I think, promising. One example I would like to cite here is the agreement to the dates of the summit and the agenda. It took very short period of time. So that's what gives us a lot of hope that there might be something happen and substantial. Everything is
wind whirling since the Winter Olympic Games wrapped up, I have to say. But having said that, though, Jenny, what do you think is the meaning behind the so-called scale down of the joint military drill between South Korea and the United States? So what do you make of this decision? Is it symbolic, or this could be the beginning of really something?
I think it was a really important decision, and this is something that we had talked about way before this. Is the military exercises are a chance to signal the nature of relations between the two Koreas, and it's very important that there was some kind of modification made. So certainly the exercises themselves weren't going to be canceled in whole. But the fact that they did make quite a sizable concession and modification on that does open the door to better will to make sure that the North Koreans understand that the signaling is there, that we want to have more substantive talks, and we are making room for, and the South Koreans are making room for further cooperation.
But Carl, when you look at the decision, it was also made almost at the same time when the South Korea, in a way, conceded to the demands by the White House to make, in a way, concessions about trading issues toward the United States. Is this going to be the trade-off that Seoul has to make all the time when it comes to its relations with the U.S.? Can Seoul really afford this kind of exchanges?
Well, so I don't think that there was a trade-off between these trade agreement and the military exercises. I do think that the military exercises and their downscaling was largely symbolic. If you talk to the military side, their primary concern is that military readiness not be compromised. So they've scaled these back to a size where the military can maintain its readiness, and those can be scaled up at any time. Of course, that's a major difference from them being canceled altogether. So the fact that they're ongoing, I think, is good cooperation between South Korea and the United States. But you're right, as South Korea moves forward, there is going to be this transactional nature, and I think that is one of the primary concerns that the South Koreans have, not only with the trade agreement, but with also the so-called special measures agreement. That is how much South Korea pays to host U.S. military in the country. Those
Right.
negotiations are ongoing, and I think are going to be very difficult.
It is going to be very difficult. In other words, here comes the ultimate issue. What kind of roles? Jenny, if I could go to you first before I go to Mr. Rong here in Beijing. Jenny, that is, what kind of role is South Korea going to play? What kind of role is the United States going to play in terms of urging the DPRK to denuclearize on the Korean Peninsula? And what would their different roles, in a way, interact with one another? Does it mean more conflict? Does it mean more consensus? That is the interesting question, Jenny.
I mean, that is the interesting question. I'm not sure any of us have a full picture yet. It does seem that the South Koreans are really trying to broker better U.S.-DPRK relations, knowing that denuclearization is the key issue in U.S.-DPRK between the two countries. And so I think, you know, part of what South Korea is trying to do now is really gain some clarity on what denuclearization looks like to the North Koreans, and to be able to convey that as well in the lead-up to U.S.-DPRK talks. But certainly, you know, when Trump meets Kim, I think we have to have very clear objectives and very realistic expectations of what should happen in that meeting. And I think too many people are thinking of it as like a one-off event. He's going to go in and solve the problem, and North Korea is just going to put their nukes on the table. And that's just setting us up for failure. I think we have to be very realistic that this is really the beginning of a diplomatic process. It's a little bit upside down for how the United States usually does stuff. But that doesn't mean it won't work, as long as, again, we go in with the understanding that, you know, that meeting will then create the mandate for further negotiations on the working level.
But here's the thing. Further negotiation, it will be aiming at something called the complete, irreversible, verifiable. Those are the phrases that we used a lot earlier when it comes to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But Carl, here's the thing. Where's the timetable? What are the step-by-step plan that all sides could agree upon? Who is going to be the guardian of the implementing of those plans, if there were any plan? So those are very concrete questions. We are here celebrating, but celebrating what, Carl?
All right, so those next steps are going to be probably what is on the table, and of course it's going to include that North Korea is going to have to identify where its nuclear sites are. The U.S. is going to push for outside inspections by the IAEA, and I think we've now come to expect that North Korea is not going to agree with any of these things. The longer these negotiations go on, the more pressure is going to build in the United States that this is just a waiting game, a tactic by North Korea to continue its program and in order to develop. Of course, they've already reached certain milestones, and so maybe there's not that much more development to do. But the longer these things go on, I think the president, especially with his new national security advisor, there's going to be growing pressure to cut those off and really get to the chase of this. And that is something that, you know, I think the president has called the kind of ominous alternative that no one wants to see happen in Northeast Asia.
Mr. Rong, of course, those tricks have been used before by one side of the six-party talks, of course, and therefore the cynicism expressed from the other two panelists you could identify. I'm sure China is also getting very sophisticated about, you know, what used to be done and have not been done and what's next. So, Mr. Rong, how shall we identify the real nature of this? What do you think could be some of the things that could really help us to understand the real essence of the reality?
Well, the real essence and nature of the issue is security. I think China made it very clear. If you look at the past, few months of interaction, that I said that it testified China's initiative, so with so-called suspension for suspension. And now we are going to the real substantial talks. Now the thinking of dual, we call parallel, parallel approach can take place, which means that the pursuit of denuclearization has to be brought in tandem with the talks of peace mechanism in place, the Armistice Treaty.
But at the same time, Mr. Rong, Mr. Kim was just in Beijing earlier talking to the Chinese president. We all read through the press release again and again, trying to read everything out of and between the lines. So, Mr. Rong, you know very well, China said it very clear. Sanctions are there. That's first. Meanwhile, China will be willing to help in a way with the process of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. So how should we identify the real nature of China's efforts as well, particularly in these various groups of tangles China would have with the United States, the DPRK, South Korea, the two Koreas, and South Korea, North Korea with the United States, a lot of different issues going on there.
I think the most important thing come out of the Beijing meeting, the meeting between President Xi and Kim, is that the North Korean side pledged its commitment to the denuclearization by saying that this is the will of the previous, his grandfather and the father, and it has to be followed. And then he also talked about the kind of formula that how to achieve the denuclearization, which he made, King made very clear that if North Korea's goodwill is being responded, and if atmosphere for peace and stability has been created. So I think now we have a clear pledge, even though it is a pledge, a commitment that being, broken before. But I think it is a very good beginning, and China made it very clear that now the next step is we have to look at the thinking proposed by China, plus other, useful ideas that would help, all the parties, the parties concerned, to get to the result. The result.
So there used to be the discussion about whether North Korea, the DPRK, would in any way willing to interact with South Korea, in any way willing to interact with China vis-a-vis the United States. For example, they might want to have direct talks with the U.S., which they should to a certain extent, but at the same time, what about the relevancy of the other parties? And by the way, do the other parties want to be that relevant in that kind of discussion? Mr. Rong, very briefly from you, what is your feeling?
I think so far, we used to have the so-called six-party talks. Now what we have found so far is kind of have bilateral meetings, that taking place simultaneously.
Right.
And these bilateral meetings, if we could have some commitment, then put together, then we can reach to a stage where the roadmap will become clear. And more importantly, I think, of course, we are all waiting for the summit meeting between the United States, Donald Trump and Kim.
Of course. Carl, what do you think? What is exactly the role description you would have for all these parties?
So, of course, everyone wants to be involved. I think we need China to be able to put pressure on North Korea. So far, it looks like it's been able to do that. In the more recent meeting in Beijing, it sounds like they pulled off some of those sanctions to get North Korea to the table. Of course, I think the United States wants South Korea to play a little bit of that brokerage role where they've been kind of the good cop to the United States bad cop. The one country we haven't talked about is Japan. It's been basically cut out of this entire process, and that is something that has left Tokyo scrambling into the kind of the midst of this. They continue to focus on abductee issues, but also what this has shown is that simply being President Trump's friend, as Prime Minister Abe has tried to be, is not going to be enough. Japan is still under the steel tariffs and, again, has been cut out of this process. And I think that's deeply disturbing for Tokyo, if not in the other countries.
All right. The other party that we haven't mentioned is Russia. Today we have already heard, Jenny, that the U.S. President Donald Trump wanted to invite Russian President Putin to the White House. Of course, no date has been set at this point. So, Jenny, what about your description and understanding of all these different role-playing by these different parties? Let's talk about Russia, China, South Korea, to you specifically.
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind, too, is as much as we want North Korea to denuclearize and to be serious about this and to make substantive moves, it's not going to come free. They're certainly going to want to have a reciprocal type of action-for-action relationship. And a lot of that, again, is geared towards security and is geared towards what they call the U.S. hostile policy. So right now you have all of these bilateral dialogues going on, I think simply to reestablish relations because North Korea had become such a pariah over the past year. That I think, once we have all of these summit meetings, if things are going down the right path, I think there is room for renewed multilateral talks. In South Korea, you do hear a lot of even wanting to resume, for instance, four-party talks, U.S., China, South Korea, North Korea. But certainly Russia is also a player in this process, a major player in this process. So I think, we have to get things moving first and started first, and I think the South Koreans were very smart to start that process, especially to avoid conflict in the region at a time when tensions were so high. And now, again, if we can get all of the leaders on board and all the high-level mutual agreement on what it is we're trying to accomplish, I think it opens the door for other types of arrangements, whether that's multilateral, four-party, five-party, or six-party. But at least then we're starting with a common understanding of where it is we're going and a common commitment among all the countries to get there.
I see. Mr. Rong in Beijing, very briefly, final words from you as well.
Well, I think we have to be hopeful, and we are hopeful, and we only hope that this time it will be different.
Okay.
And we have to be hopeful.
All right. I remember you said at the very beginning of our show, cautiously optimistic. All right. For now, I want to thank the three of you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Jenny Tang, Rong Ying, Carl Friedhoff. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being with us.